Hello and welcome to the History 2020 lecture series here at East Tennessee State University. My name is Melanie Story, and in this lecture we'll examine the time period of the late 19th century known as the Gilded Age. Specifically in this lecture, we will address the major features and characteristics of politics at the local, state, and national levels during the Gilded Age. We'll also look at the major issues in the political realm during this time period. Finally, we'll consider the efforts to reform the political process, and we'll talk about the results of those attempts. So imagine for a moment, if you will, that the date is July 2nd, 1881, and already at 9:30 a.m. it's promising to be a very hot and muggy day in Washington, D.C. President James Garfield is walking through the railroad station in order to board a train headed for Massachusetts. Garfield has only been in office for a few short months. Suddenly, shots ring out, and tragically the president falls to the ground with a bullet lodged in his back. Garfield, a veteran of the recent Civil War, knows that the wound is mortal. Indeed, doctors tried everything they could think of, but they succeeded in mostly infecting the wound by probing for the bullet with unsterilized instruments. Sadly, President Garfield dies on September 19, 1881, from the assassin's bullet fired by Charles Guiteau. Guiteau had surrendered to the police soon after firing the shots at the president. He had been a loyal supporter of Garfield during his campaign, and he had expected a diplomatic assignment in return for his support. When Guiteau was passed over for the job, he became angry, some say even mentally unbalanced, and he decided at that point he would kill the president. Guiteau was tried and hanged for the assassination of President Garfield in June 1882. Many contemporaries used the assassination of Garfield to highlight the corruptness of politics, and they called for reform. So exactly what do we mean by the term Gilded Age? In 1873, several years before the Garfield assassination, writers Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner created an enduring label for the post-Civil War era when they collaborated on a novel titled The Gilded Age. The book depicts an age of widespread corruption and greed of privileged interest. Twain and Warner made this point very clear when they wrote, quote, "What is the chief end of man? To get rich. In what way? Dishonestly if we can, but honestly if we must." The term Gilded Age means that while on the surface things may appear to glitter, beneath the surface there was corruption. Politics, more than any other sphere, seemed to express this prevailing mood of corruption. For instance, office holders used their positions to amass personal fortunes and dispense patronage appointments to their supporters. Also, political parties seemed to be much more interested in divvying up the spoils of office rather than running the affairs of the nation. Yet, ironically, the office of president was filled with a series of honest, respectable men. Although respectable, these men spanning from Rutherford Hayes to William McKinley are not generally remembered for their strong administrations. Generally speaking, you will not see the names Chester Arthur or Grover Cleveland on the top 10 list of notable American presidents. But in the years after Reconstruction, this was exactly how Americans preferred it. During this time, the American people didn't look for charismatic personalities or dramatic leadership in their presidents. Instead, they preferred men who accepted the limits of executive power. As a young college graduate in 1879, future President Woodrow Wilson described the state of the post-Civil War political system as, quote, "No leaders, no principles, no parties." So let's take a little closer look at the characteristics of political life during the Gilded Age. Political life in the Gilded Age, which roughly denotes the years from 1870 to 1894, had several distinctive elements. Competition between the two major political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, was intense. Presidential elections were often very close contests. The elections between the years 1877 and 1894 are very good illustrations of this aspect, and the margins of victory were very slim. During this time, neither party could muster a majority over the other. Also, between 1877 and 1894, Republicans held the presidency for 12 years and Democrats for 8 years. The same party controlled the presidency and both houses of Congress only 3 times, and even then only for a 2-year span. The Republicans did this twice and the Democrats once. So because the president was rarely of the same party as the majority of Congress, the two branches often blocked rather than supported each other's efforts to achieve reform. To meet the challenges, party leadership sought to bolster the loyalty of their followers. Democrats rebuilt their strength in the South, while Republicans struggled to maintain the loyalties of the working class and also to increase support from the business element. In cities crowded with waves of new immigrants, politics was usually controlled by small groups of political insiders who managed nominations and the election of candidates and also influenced policymaking. Each of these political rings typically had a boss who ran things, using his so-called machine, which was a network of neighborhood activists and officials to govern the town or city. Whether officially serving as mayor or not, the boss wielded enormous influence in city government. He took care of such things as organizing neighborhoods into precincts. He mediated disputes. The boss picked candidates. He helped the needy in return for votes. He distributed patronage in the form of municipal jobs and contracts to loyal followers and corporate contributors. So by the end of the 20th century, many cities had experienced a form of machine rule. Working through ward captains to turn out voters, the machine could control such things as who was hired for police and fire departments. Also, the machine rewarded its friends and punished its enemies through its control of taxes, licenses, and inspections. For instance, tax breaks were often given to favored contractors in return for large payoffs, while enemies of the machine might find themselves subjected to frequent inspections or high-priced licenses. At the neighborhood level, the ward bosses often acted as a welfare agent, helping the needy and protecting those in trouble. This helped to build loyalty and to win the machine the votes that they needed. So as you can imagine, the bosses and their political machines were usually corrupt and rarely efficient. But interestingly enough, they did bring structure, stability, and services to a rapidly growing and often chaotic inner-city community. Colorful figures such as New York City's William Boss Tweed shamelessly ruled, plundered, and occasionally improved municipal government, often through dishonest means and frequent bribes. Between 1869 and 1871, it's estimated that Tweed gave $50,000 to help the poor, and over $2 million to schools, orphanages, and hospitals. In these same years, however, his machine dispensed 60,000 patronage positions and increased the city's debt by $70 million through graft and corruption. Up until his arrest in 1871 and his eventual conviction in 1873, Boss Tweed used the Tammany Hall ring to dominate the nation's largest city. National political parties during the Gilded Age were much more dominant forces than they are today. Party loyalty was very powerful, often extending through many generations. Parties were also the center of political activity. They controlled access to political offices, they dominated elections, and they shaped policymaking. Throughout the last third of the 19th century, a close balance between Republicans and Democrats in Congress created a sense of a stalemate. Neither party was willing to embrace controversial issues or take bold initiatives because neither had a commanding advantage with the electorate. So because of this, the Gilded Age has long been viewed as a time of political mediocrity, a time in which the parties refused to confront the so-called real issues, things such as the runaway growth of an unregulated economy, or give attention to serious social injustices. Yet voters of the time nonetheless thought politics was very important. Voter turnout during the Gilded Age was commonly about 70 to 80%. In contrast, the turnout for the 2008 presidential election was almost 57%, and for the 2012 presidential election about 54%. In light of such a high rate of voter participation, this raises an important question. How was it that leaders who failed to address the real issues of the day preside over the most politically active electorate in U.S. history? The answer is partly that politicians and the voters believed they were dealing with the crucial issues. Things such as tariff rates, regulation of corporations, monetary policy, Native American disputes, civil service reform, immigration. All these things were considered the real issues by the people of the time. Yet the answer also reflects the extreme partisanship of the times and the essentially local nature of the political culture during the Gilded Age. Most Americans after the Civil War were intensely loyal to either the Democrat or the Republican Party. Party loyalties and voter turnout in the late 19th century reflected religious and ethnic divisions as well as geographic differences. For instance, the Republican Party attracted mainly Protestants with Anglo-Saxon descent. They were primarily concentrated in rural and small-town New England, Pennsylvania, and the upper Midwest. As the party of Abraham Lincoln, it drew great support from the Grand Army of the Republic, or the GAR, which was a social and political lobbying organization of Union Civil War veterans. Politically, they practiced what was called waving the bloody shirt. That is, they reminded American voters that it was the Democrats who were the party of traitors, and their actions had led to a bloody Civil War. Republicans, in order to emphasize their patriotism, ran a series of former Union Army generals for president and voted for generous veterans' benefits. Yet feuds and personal rivalries were apparent within the ranks of the Republican Party. One faction, called the Stalwarts, was led by Senator Roscoe Conkling. Conkling sought party influence and government jobs for his supporters. The name was derived from the fact that they had been stalwart in their support of President Ulysses S. Grant. Another faction of the Republican Party was called the Half-Breeds, and they were led by Senator James G. Blaine, who also sought influence. They acquired their name because they were only half loyal to President Grant and half committed to the reform of the spoils system. The Mugwumps faction of the Republican Party was led by Senator Carl Shores, and they disliked the political corruption and believed that only righteous, dedicated men like themselves should govern. Their name is derived from an Algonquin term that meant renegade chief. So now let's look at the Democrat Party. The Democrats ruled in the South, in southern sections of border states like Ohio, and in northern cities with large immigrant populations. They tended to be heterogeneous, often an unruly coalition that embraced Southern whites, immigrants, and Catholics of any national origin from the northern states. Democrats tended to campaign for minimal government expenditures. They opposed tariff increases and generally attacked what they considered to be too much government interference in the economy. In fact, many members of both parties embraced the doctrine of laissez-faire. In this view, they believed that the federal government should promote economic development, but that it should not try to regulate industry. Although issues of government authority dominated on the federal level, family tradition, religious affiliation, and local issues often determined an individual's vote. Political differences, for instance, often centered on cultural differences, most notably prohibition. That was a very hot topic. Among the immigrants who crowded into the growing cities were many Irish, Germans, and Italians who tended to enjoy alcoholic beverages. So any talk of prohibition always stimulated voter interest among these groups. Republicans increasingly saw saloons as the center of all social evils, around which other problems such as crime, political corruption, and neglect of families revolved. The Republican Party was seen as, quote, the party of morality, and one Chicago Democrat explained the difference. He says, quote, a Republican is a man who wants you to go to church every Sunday. A Democrat says if a man wants to have a glass of beer on Sunday, he can have it. While Democrats were intolerant of racial differences, Republicans pressed for nativist policies, calling for restrictions on both immigration and the employment of foreigners. Overall, political parties gave people an anchor for their activity and their loyalty in a very unstable world. The party faithful eagerly took part in rallies and picnics, deriving from them a sense of camaraderie, as well as an opportunity for recreation that offered a welcome relief from their usual workday routine. And for all of its formal weaknesses, politics figured centrally into the nation's life. Indeed, politics was a prime form of mass entertainment that outdistanced baseball, vaudeville, and even circuses. At times it resembled circuses. Voting was only the last stage in a process that included political rallies, parades, picnics, and speeches. A good example of some of the activities surrounding the political process was the election of 1884. This election pitted Republican James G. Blaine, who was from Maine, against the New York Democrat candidate Grover Cleveland. The entire campaign was a mudslinging affair to the delight of the American public. And during the campaign, it was revealed that Blaine, while serving as Speaker of the House, had sold his votes on legislation which favored railroad companies, and he'd made a very nice profit off of this. The Democrats had chosen their candidate, Grover Cleveland, because he had built a record of reform as mayor of Buffalo and then later as governor of New York. However, also during the campaign, it was revealed that Cleveland, a bachelor, had fathered an illegitimate child in 1874. Now, Cleveland had never denied the child was his, and he had actually provided financial support for the child. But nevertheless, it damaged his reputation. Toward the end of the campaign, Blaine made some other blunders. First, in New York City, Blaine attended a private dinner with several millionaire bigwigs to discuss campaign finances. Given his reputation of corruption, you can only imagine that the press was not very kind to Blaine when they found out about this meeting. Also, the second fiasco involving Blaine occurred when one member of a delegation of Protestant ministers who was visiting Republican headquarters in New York referred to the Democrats as the party of, quote, rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Blaine, who was present when this comment was made, let it pass, and it was an implied insult to Catholics. And this was a very crucial oversight on Blaine because he tried to cultivate the Irish American support who were primarily of the Catholic faith. So word began to spread that Blaine was anti-Irish and anti-Catholic. So then at all the political rallies, the Democrats would chant, "Blaine, Blaine, James G. Blaine, the Continental Liar from the state of Maine." Republicans would reply with, "Ma, ma, where's my pa?" And then after Cleveland won the election, Democrats would answer, "He's gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha." Now, while I realize this seems very corny to us today, it does help to understand how intense the rivalry was between the parties. You can think about it as almost like attending a pep rally with fans doing lots of trash talking against the opponents before a football game. As previously mentioned, throughout the late 19th century, elections were extremely close, especially on the national level. For instance, the election of 1876 between Democrat candidate Samuel Tilden and Republican candidate Rutherford Hayes was disputed because both parties had used fraud in the South. People who were known to be dead ended up on the poll lists, while others turned out early and often to vote. The election was disputed, and it was up to the House of Representatives to sort out the mess. So after a deal was brokered whereby Northern troops would be completely removed from the South, the House finally declared Hayes to be the winner, but Democrats often called him his fraudulency and rather fraud Hayes. Now let's examine the efforts of reform during the Gilded Age. During the Gilded Age, a close alliance developed between business owners and political leaders at every level of government. Railroad passes, free entertainment, and a host of other favors were freely provided to politicians, newspaper editors, and to other leaders in positions so they could influence public opinion or affect legislation. And as we have already established, both Republican and Democrat leaders fought over the so-called spoils of office, that is, the appointed offices at the local and national levels. For decades, successful candidates in national, state, and local elections rewarded their supporters with jobs ranging from cabinet seats to municipal posts. Defenders called this system rotation in office and claimed that it was entirely democratic because it was a good way of filling government positions. Those who supported it believed that it avoided creating a permanent class of office holders. Critics, though, called it the spoils system, and they argued that awarding government jobs to supporters invited corruption. It was also time-consuming in that it distracted elected officials from more important issues. They were too busy handing out political offices than they were dealing with the issues at hand. Each party had its share of corrupt officials willing to buy and sell government appointments or congressional votes. Yet each also witnessed the emergence of factions promoting honesty in government. The struggle for a so-called cleaner government soon became one of the foremost issues of the day. So let's consider the issue of civil service reform. In the aftermath of Reconstruction, President Rutherford B. Hayes embodied the party of morality. Hayes brought to the White House in 1877 a new style of uprightness in sharp contrast to the corruption practiced by members of the Grant administration. Hayes aligned himself with the growing public discontent over political corruption in the Grant administration. And in promoting civil service reform, Hayes issued an executive order in 1877 declaring that those already in office would be dismissed only for the good of the government and not for political reasons. Yet for all of Hayes's efforts to clean house, he retained a limited vision of government's role in society. Civil service reform was finally addressed after a national tragedy took place. As mentioned earlier, the assassination of President James Garfield awakened the American public to political reform. And as a result, a civil service reform bill, which was sponsored by George Pendleton, who was a Democratic senator of Ohio, he sponsored this bill, and it passed in 1883, which set up the Civil Service Commission, and it was called the Pendleton Act. Under the Pendleton Act, about 14% of all government jobs would now be filled on the basis of competitive examinations rather than political connections. Moreover, the law allowed the president to enlarge the class of jobs based on merit at his discretion, as many presidents later did. Another controversial national political issue involved the tariff. The high tariff, a heritage of the Civil War, had by the 1880s raised federal revenues to a point where the government was enjoying a surplus that drew money into the Treasury but out of circulation, thus impeding economic growth. Some argued that lower tariff rates would reduce consumer prices by enabling foreign competition and at the same time leave more money in circulation. In 1883, some tariff reform was made in that a new tariff provided for a slight rate reduction. And this is a topic that we will revisit in another lecture. In an effort to address the growing power of trusts and monopolies, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in 1890. Ohio Senator John Sherman drafted the bill which forbade contract, combinations, or conspiracies in restraint of trade. It was an extremely vague law, and after its passage, it was mostly symbolic. During the next decade, presidential administrations rarely enforced this law, in part because of the confusion about what exactly constituted, quote, restraint of trade. From 1890 to 1901, the Justice Department instituted only 18 antitrust suits, and 4 of those were against labor unions. Congress also debated currency legislation against the backdrop of growing distress in the farm regions of the West and in the South. Hard-pressed farmers demanded increased coinage of silver to inflate the currency supply and raise commodity prices. This, they argued, would make it easier for them to earn the money they needed to pay off their debts. Members from new Western states with silver mining interests also strengthened the Silverite forces, especially in the Senate. Congress passed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which required the Treasury to purchase 4.5 million ounces of silver each month and to issue in payment paper money redeemable in gold or in silver. Although it doubled the amount of silver purchased, that was still too little to inflate the nation's overall money supply. So the stage was thus set for the currency issue to eclipse all other issues during the financial panic that would sweep the country 3 years later. This is also a topic that we will address in much greater detail in another lecture. So, for nearly 30 years after Reconstruction, American politics seemed to be locked into a rigid stalemate. The electorate was almost evenly divided, and the two major parties differed on only a few issues. A series of dull, respectable presidents presided over this political system, symbols of its stability and its passivity. Beneath the calm surface of national politics, however, great social issues were creating deep divisions. Soon to erupt were battles between employers and workers, and also a growing resentment among American farmers facing declining prosperity.